The price of pride. A cold night in New York. The shocking hook. They say love is blind, but in the high-stakes world of the New York elite, love is just a high-standing real estate transaction. Ethan Sterling, a tech tycoon valued at billions of dollars, thought he held all the cards. He thought his wife, Clara, was nothing more than a penniless orphan, a piece of decoration he could discard like yesterday's newspaper. He humiliated her. He destroyed her. And finally, in front of 300 distinguished guests in the heart of the American metropolis, he threw her out into the cold rain. But Ethan made a fatal miscalculation. He didn't know who Clara really was. He didn't know that behind that supposed orphan rose a shadow larger than his entire tech empire. Today, the doors of the Southern District Court of New York are about to open. And the man who thought himself a king is about to learn a brutal lesson in humility, courtesy of karma, but with an American accent. Stay tuned, because the karma awaiting Ethan Sterling is not just harsh, it's lethal. The noble national audience. The storm begins. The air inside room 402 of the New York State Supreme Court was so thick and charged with tension that you could cut it with a steak knife. The neons buzzed overhead, casting a sterile and relentless glow over the polished mahogany tables. Outside, an autumn storm lashed the city, dumping furious rain against the tall windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline. But inside, the storm was entirely human. On the plaintiff's side sat Ethan Sterling. At 34, Ethan was the living portrait of modern corporate arrogance. He wore a custom charcoal Armani suit that cost more than the annual salary of many New Yorkers. He leaned back with studied indifference, tapping a gold mechanical pencil against the notepad in front of him. He was the CEO of Sterling Digital, a rising star in the American tech landscape, and his face often graced the covers of Business Insider and Vogue. He looked at the jury not with respect, but with a charming, rehearsed smile that seemed to say, "I shouldn't even be here. This is a waste of my valuable time." On the defendant's side, across from him, sat Clara. She looked nothing like the woman who had appeared in the society pages on Ethan's arm just a year ago. She wore a simple, inexpensive gray blouse and black pants. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and she wore no jewelry, especially no wedding ring. She sat with her back straight, hands firmly crossed in her lap, staring fixedly at the empty witness stand. She looked small, fragile, and completely out of her element. "All rise!" bellowed the bailiff, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "The Honorable Judge Thomas Allister is presiding." Judge Allister, a man known for his zero-tolerance policy for courtroom theater, was nearing 70, with gray hair and steely eyes that had witnessed every lie New York had to offer. He took his seat, adjusted his robe, and looked over his glasses. "Be seated," Judge Allister said in a grave voice. "We are here for the case of Sterling versus Sterling. The plaintiff, Mr. Ethan Sterling, requests the annulment of the marriage based on fraud and claims damages for defamation. The defendant, Mrs. Clara Sterling, presents a counterclaim for unjustified dissolution of marital assets and moral damages." The judge looked at Ethan's lawyer, a legal predator named Jonas Shaw. Shaw was known on Wall Street as the city butcher. He didn't just win cases, he destroyed lives. "Mr. Shaw," the judge nodded, "you may proceed with your opening statement." Shaw stood up, buttoning his double-breasted suit jacket. He walked toward the jury box, establishing eye contact with each member. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Shaw began in a voice smooth as silk, "this is a simple case of predator and prey, but not in the way you might think." What do you think, our readers? Do you think money always corrupts? Leave your opinion before the story takes a turn. According to my client, Mr. Sterling is a self-made man. He built a tech empire from a small apartment in Brooklyn. He fell in love with the defendant, a woman who claimed to be a waitress with no family, no connections, and no money. He took her in. He gave her a life of luxury in a penthouse on the Upper East Side. And how did she pay him back? By humiliating him, refusing to adapt to his world. And finally, when he tried to end the marriage amicably, she went to the press to spread malicious lies that tarnished the value of his company's shares. We are here today to prove that Clara Sterling is an imposter, a gold digger who failed at her only job, being a supportive wife. Ethan smiled from his table. He leaned toward his associate lawyer and whispered loud enough for Clara to hear. She'll be lucky if she can afford a bus ticket out of the city when I'm done with her. Clara didn't flinch. She simply kept her gaze forward, waiting. The disaster. In the Hamptons. The first witness called by the prosecution was intended to be the nail in Clara's coffin. It was Mrs. Beatrice Vanderbilt, a high society socialite and wife of a banking mogul from Greenwich. She was dressed in a tweed suit and pearls, clutching a designer handbag as if the courtroom air might contaminate it. Mrs. Vanderbilt, Shaw said, pacing in front of the stand. Were you present at the Sterling Charity Gala last October 14th, held at an exclusive estate in the Hamptons? I was, Mrs. Vanderbilt said, sniffing with disdain. It was the event of the season. Everyone was there. The senator, the board of directors. It was supposed to be a sophisticated evening, and I could describe the behavior of the defendant, Clara Sterling. That night, Mrs. Vanderbilt wrinkled her nose, looking at Clara with pure disgust. It was appalling. Ethan, Mr. Sterling, was trying to close a very important deal with a Japanese delegation. Clara sat there, completely out of place. She wore a dress that looked, well, from a clearance rack. When the delegation asked her a question about the wine, she stammered. She didn't know the difference between a fine Cabernet and a simple table wine. It was humiliating for Ethan. You could see the shame on his face. Clara's lawyer, a sharp young attorney named Sarah Jenkins, scribbled furiously on her pad. But she didn't object. And what happened next? Shaw pressed, enjoying the narrative. She spilled it, Mrs. Vanderbilt said dramatically. She tried to reach for the salt shaker, something no one does at a 5-course dinner, and knocked a glass of red wine directly onto the white tablecloth, splashing the Japanese investor's wife. The room went silent. It was the clumsy act of a peasant. Shaw nodded gravely. And how did Mr. Sterling react? He did what any strong leader would do, Mrs. Vanderbilt said. He took control. He apologized to the guests and told Clara to leave. He told her to go home because she was ruining the most important night of his career. Shaw turned to the jury. He asked her to leave. But did she leave quietly? No, Mrs. Vanderbilt shook her head. She started crying, pleading. Ethan, please, it was an accident. It was pathetic. She made a scene. Finally, Ethan had to physically escort her to the doors. Thank you, Mrs. Vanderbilt. Shaw sat down with a satisfied air. Sarah Jenkins, Clara's lawyer, stood up. She didn't seem intimidated by the wealthy socialite. Mrs. Vanderbilt, Sarah began, you said Ethan escorted her. Did he have a hand on her arm? Yes. Was he gripping her tightly? He was firm. He had to be. Did he open the car door for her? Mrs. Vanderbilt hesitated. He opened the main doors of the estate. Yes. And how was the weather that night, Mrs. Vanderbilt? It was raining. Quite hard. Did Mr. Sterling offer his wife a coat? I don't remember. Did he call a taxi or his chauffeur? He told the valet parking not to go near her. Mrs. Vanderbilt admitted, lowering her voice slightly. He said she could walk, so she would snap out of her nonsense. A murmur ran through the room. Sarah Jenkins let the silence linger. So, Sarah said, raising her voice. To be clear, Mr. Sterling threw his wife out of a gala in a dress you described as thin, in the middle of a freezing storm, without a coat, and ordered the staff not to help her. Is that correct? She ruined the dinner, Mrs. Vanderbilt snapped. She deserved to be taught a lesson. No more questions, and Mrs. Vanderbilt stepped down. Ethan looked annoyed. He leaned toward Shaw. Why did you let her say that about the chauffeur? Fix it. Relax, Shaw whispered. We're establishing that you're a man of standards and that she was useless. The jury won't care about a little rain when we reveal the financial fraud. The ace up the lawyer's sleeve. The trial continued in the afternoon. The rain beat against the glass harder, reflecting the storm brewing inside. Shaw called his next witness. He called Jessica Vance to testify. The doors opened, and in walked a woman who was the polar opposite of Clara. Jessica Vance was tall, blonde, and undeniably stunning. She wore a red dress that was almost inappropriate for a courtroom, but she wore it with blatant confidence. She was Ethan's executive assistant. As she passed Clara's table, she gave her a smug smile, a look of pure predatory victory. Clara looked down at her hands, her knuckles turning white. Ms. Vance? Shaw smiled. Boss, please inform the court about your relationship with Mr. Sterling. I have been Ethan's executive assistant for 3 years, Jessica said in a seductive voice. I manage his schedule, his travel, and his personal affairs when his wife cannot. Were you aware of the financial arrangement between Mr. Sterling and the defendant? Yes, Jessica said. Ethan was very generous. He didn't want a prenuptial agreement. He trusted her. But about 6 months ago, we found discrepancies in the household accounts, money moving to offshore accounts. Small amounts at first, then larger. Shaw held up a document. Is this the report you found? Yes. Clara was siphoning money. We believe she planned to leave him and take a cut. That's why Ethan was so nervous the night of the gala. He knew she was stealing from him. The jury gasped. The financial theft changed the narrative. Suddenly, Ethan wasn't just a cruel husband, but a victim of a con artist. Sarah Jenkins stood up for the cross-examination. Vance, Sarah said calmly, you say you handle Mr. Sterling's personal affairs. Does that include sharing his hotel room on business trips to Dubai, Paris, and Rome? Objection, Shaw shouted. Relevance. Goes to credibility and bias, Your Honor, Sarah argued. If the witness is romantically involved with the plaintiff, her testimony regarding the wife is suspect. Objection overruled, Judge Allister said. Answer the question. Jessica stiffened. Ethan and I have a close professional relationship. We travel together. Yes. And did you, on the night of the gala, tell Clara in the restroom that she should enjoy the champagne because it would be her last glass? Jessica's eyes went wide. I never said that. We have a restroom attendant prepared to testify otherwise, Sarah bluffed. It was a bluff. But it worked. Jessica got nervous. I might have said something about her time being up. She was bad for the company's image. Look at her. She's a little mouse. Ethan needed a lioness. He needed someone who understood power. So you admit you wanted her gone? We all wanted her gone, Jessica shouted, losing her composure. Ethan hated coming home to her. He told me she was just a placeholder until the company's IPO went public. He threw her out because he was finally done pretending. The courtroom buzzed. Jessica had just admitted Ethan's cruelty was premeditated. Ethan put his hand to his face, rubbing his temples. This was becoming a disaster. He stood up, ignoring protocol. Enough, Ethan bellowed, silencing the room. "The point is, she is nobody. I pulled her off the street and tried to polish her. But dirt is dirt. I threw her out because she didn't belong in my world, and now I want her to pay for dragging my name through the mud." Judge Allister banged the gavel. "Mr. Sterling, sit down, or I will find you in contempt." Ethan sat down, adjusting his tie, his face flushed with rage. "Finish this," he whispered to Shaw. Shaw looked at the judge. "The prosecution rests, Your Honor." Judge Allister turned to Sarah Jenkins. "Does the defense have any witnesses?" Sarah Jenkins stood up slowly. She didn't look at the jury. She looked at Ethan. A small, cold smile played on her lips. "Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls only one witness." She paused for effect. "We call the magistrate Mr. Arthur Sterling de la Serna." At the mention of the name, the air in the room changed. Several jury members straightened up. Even the judge blinked in surprise. "Arthur Sterling?" Ethan whispered, confused. "The CEO of Sterling Global, the billionaire who owns half the land in Florida. Why on earth is he her witness?" Shaw was pale. "No, I don't know, Ethan. Maybe she cleaned his floors." Ethan scoffed, trying to regain his composure. "Maybe it's a charity case." "We call Arthur Sterling de la Serna to the stand," Sarah repeated. The revelation of the lineage. The twist. The heavy double doors at the back of the room swung wide. They didn't just open. They were held by two men in dark suits, who looked more like Secret Service agents than private security. Arthur Sterling de la Serna entered. At 78, the man was a living legend of the financial world and the Fortune 500. He moved with a slow and deliberate gait, leaning on a cane topped with a silver wolf's head. But there was no fragility in him. His presence sucked the oxygen out of the room. He wore a perfectly tailored navy three-piece suit, and his white hair was slicked back, revealing a face carved in granite. The silence in the court was absolute. Even Judge Allister sat up straighter, adjusting his glasses. The court reporter stopped typing for a fraction of a second, stunned. Ethan Sterling stared, his mouth slightly open. He leaned toward his lawyer. What was he doing here? Did she work for him? Is that it? She was his maid. Shaw was sweating. He wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. "Shut up, Ethan. Just shut up." Arthur Sterling passed the defense table. He didn't look at the jury. He didn't look at the judge. He stopped in front of Clara. For the first time since the trial began, Clara looked up. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but when she looked at the old man, a soft, sad smile touched her lips. Arthur placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of immense protection. He whispered something to her that no one else heard. Then he turned and headed to the witness stand. "State your name for the record," the bailiff said, his voice slightly trembling. "Arthur James Sterling de la Serna," the billionaire said. His voice was deep, resonant, like a cello. "Chairman of Sterling Global Group." Sarah Jenkins, Clara's lawyer, approached the stand. She looked confident. Her posture reflected the power of her witness. "Mr. Sterling," Sarah began, "thank you for coming. I know you are a private man. Could you explain to the court your relationship with the defendant, Clara Sterling?" Arthur's steel-blue eyes turned to Ethan. The look was so cold, so full of disdain, that Ethan shivered. "Clara is not Clara Sterling to me," Arthur said slowly. "Nor is she Clara Vance, the name she used when she moved to the city to escape the paparazzi." He paused, letting the suspense build. "She is Clara Sterling de la Serna, my granddaughter, and the sole heir to the Sterling family fortune." A collective gasp ripped through the court. It was louder than the thunder outside. The jury members looked at each other with wide eyes. The court reporter's jaw dropped. "Objection!" Shaw jumped up, knocking over his chair. This This is absurd. We have her birth certificate. Her parents were nobodies from Ohio." "Sit down, Mr. Shaw," Judge Allister barked. "Mr. Sterling, please clarify." Arthur reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded document. "My son, Clara's father, died when she was young. To protect her from kidnappers and fortune hunters, we sealed her records. She wanted to live a normal life. She wanted to find a man who loved her for who she was, not for the billions she will inherit. She wanted to be sure." Arthur looked back at Ethan. "So she became a waitress. She lived in a small apartment. And then she met you, Mr. Sterling. She told me she had found a diamond in the rough, a man who loved her, even though she had nothing." Arthur's laugh was dry and humorless. "But it turns out you didn't love her because she had nothing. You loved her because you thought she was weak. You thought she was someone you could control." Ethan shook his head, his face pale. "No, that's a lie. She's lying. She's a fraud. She deceived me." "Deceived?" Arthur's voice rose, thundering in the room. "You talk of deception. You, who cheated on her with your secretary while spending her money." "I never spent her money," Ethan shouted. "She was broke. I paid for everything." Arthur leaned into the microphone. "Are you sure about that, boy?" Sarah Jenkins returned to her table and picked up a thick stack of financial documents. She handed them to the bailiff to distribute to the jury and the plaintiff. "Evidence," Sarah announced. "Mr. Sterling, can you explain what these documents are?" Arthur put on some reading glasses. "These are the transaction records for Sterling Digital over the last 2 years. Specifically, the capital injections that saved the company from bankruptcy 18 months ago." Ethan froze. 18 months ago, his company had hit rock bottom. He was desperate. Then, miraculously, an anonymous angel investor had stepped in through a shell company called Aurora Holdings, injecting $20 million. "I see you remember," Arthur said, watching Ethan's face. "Did you think Aurora Holdings was some offshore group interested in your tech?" "It wasn't." Arthur pointed to Clara. "It was her." The court exploded again. Judge Allister pounded the gavel furiously. "Order! Order in this court!" When the noise subsided, Arthur continued, his voice cutting through the silence. "Clara saw you were struggling. She saw you were stressed. She came to me and asked for her trust fund in advance. She wanted to save her husband's dream. She channeled $20 million into your company anonymously because she knew your ego was too fragile to accept money from your wife." Ethan looked at the documents in his hands. The signature at the bottom of the transfer order was undeniable. Clara Sterling de la Serna. "She saved you," Arthur said, his voice dripping with disgust. "She saved your company. She saved your reputation. And how did you pay her back? You mocked her upbringing. You belittled her style. You cheated on her." And then Arthur's eyes darkened. "Then came the gala." "The gala was a disaster," Shaw interjected, trying to save the sinking ship. "She insulted the Japanese delegation. She ruined the deal." Arthur smiled. It was a terrifying sight. "Mr. Shaw, do you know who the head of that Japanese delegation was?" "Mr. Kenji Tanaka." Yes, of course," Shaw stammered. "Kenji Tanaka is my godson," Arthur said calmly. "I asked him to attend that gala to evaluate Ethan. I wanted to see if he was finally worthy of knowing Clara's true identity." Arthur leaned back. "Kenji called me 10 minutes after leaving. He didn't leave because Clara spilled wine. He left because he saw a husband reprimand his wife in public. He saw you, Ethan, grab her arm. He saw you throw her into the rain. In Japanese culture, honor is everything, and you showed you had none. Kenji told me, 'Uncle, this man is trash. Get Clara out of there." Ethan sank into his chair. He looked small. The billionaire's arrogant posture had vanished, replaced by the slouch of a defeated child. "So," Sarah Jenkins said, driving the point home, "the fraud Ethan accused her of, the money moving to offshore accounts. What was that? Was Clara trying to move her remaining assets out of your reach once she realized you were having an affair with Ms. Vance? It wasn't your money she was moving, Ethan. It was hers. And frankly, compared to the sterling fortune, the crumbs in your joint account were irrelevant. Question for the audience. If you were in Clara's place, would you have used the money to save the company of a cheating husband? Tell us what you would have done in the comments section. The morality clause, the revenge. The atmosphere in room 402 had transformed from a domestic dispute to something much more lethal. It was no longer a divorce trial. It was an autopsy of Ethan Sterling's arrogance. The revelation that Clara was a Sterling, the sole heir to one of the largest fortunes in the Western Hemisphere, had suffocated the air. Ethan was paralyzed. His hands gripped the edge of the mahogany table so hard, his knuckles had turned white as a skeleton. Beside him, his lawyer, Jonas Shaw, frantically shuffled papers, his city butcher persona dissolving into panic. "Did you know?" he whispered furiously to Ethan. "How could you not know? You've been married to her for 2 years, Ethan. How do you miss a $10 billion trust fund?" "I didn't know," Ethan hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. "She told me she was from Ohio. She told me her parents died in a car accident." "They did," Arthur Sterling's voice thundered from the stand, cutting through their low discussion like a broadsword. "And when they died, I promised to protect her from parasites. It seems I let one slip through the cracks." Sarah Jenkins, Clara's lawyer, walked to the center of the room. She no longer looked like a divorce lawyer. She looked like an executioner. She signaled the bailiff, who brought over a cart stacked with heavy leather binders. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice dangerously quiet. "The plaintiff, Mr. Sterling, has spent this entire trial painting my client as a financial burden. He claims she was a drain on his resources. He claims he wants the annulment to protect his company, Sterling Digital, from her incompetence." She picked up a thick document. "We have already established that the $20 million injection that saved his company 18 months ago came from Aurora Holdings, a shell company owned by Mrs. Sterling. But what Mr. Sterling seems to have forgotten, or perhaps was too arrogant to read, are the terms attached to that capital." Sarah turned to Ethan. She held the document high. "Mr. Sterling, do you recognize this? This is the sovereign debt agreement you signed with Aurora Holdings." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "I signed 100 contracts that year. We were expanding." It was boilerplate text. "Boilerplate?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. She walked to the stand and handed the document to Arthur Sterling. "Mr. Sterling, as the executor of the trust that manages Aurora Holdings, could you please read Clause 14, Section B, regarding good faith and morality covenants?" Arthur adjusted his glasses. He looked at Ethan with the pity one might show a rabid dog before putting it down. "Clause 14, Section B," Arthur read, his deep voice echoing off the walls. "The borrower, Mr. Ethan Sterling, acknowledges that the lender, Aurora Holdings, maintains a reputation of high ethical standards. Consequently, if the borrower engages in any public conduct that brings disrepute, embarrassment, or scandal to the lender, or if the borrower shows gross negligence in the management of his personal or professional affairs that reflects negatively on the investment." Arthur paused, his eyes fixed on Ethan. "Then the lender reserves the right to classify the loan as in immediate default. Upon default, the total principal sum of $20 million, plus accrued interest, becomes due and payable within 60 minutes of notification." The silence that followed was absolute. Ethan laughed nervously. It was a dry, raspy sound. Disrepute scandal. That's subjective. You can't enforce that. I haven't done anything illegal. I just filed for divorce. It's not about the divorce, Ethan, Arthur said, closing the folder. It's about the gala. Sarah Jenkins stepped in. You humiliated your wife in front of the city's elite. You physically ejected her from the premises into a storm. You allowed your staff to mock her. And, as we established through Ms. Vance's testimony, you were conducting an illicit affair with your secretary while representing the company. Sarah addressed the jury. But here is the most important part. Since she is now the owner of Aurora Holdings, when you humiliated her, you were humiliating the lender. You were publicly embarrassing the very hand that fed you. This is ridiculous! Shaw stood up, sweat visible on his forehead. This is a reach, Your Honor. A morality clause is usually reserved for celebrity endorsements, not corporate loans. You can't demand a $20 million payment over a bad dinner party. In fact, Arthur interrupted softly, we can, and we have. Arthur pulled a thin black smartphone from his pocket. He tapped the screen twice. At 1:15 this afternoon, exactly 20 minutes ago, my legal team in Zurich formalized the notice of default. It was delivered electronically to your CFO. Ethan reached for his own phone. His hands were shaking so much, he dropped it on the table before clumsily picking it up. He dialed his CFO's number. Answer! Answer, you idiot! Ethan muttered, panic rising in his chest like bile. The call connected. Ethan! The voice on the other end sounded terrified. Ethan, what's happening? The bank just blocked our access. I can't get into the payroll accounts. I'm getting alerts from the SEC. They say liquidity has been withdrawn. What do you mean blocked? Ethan shouted, forgetting he was in a courtroom. Override it. Call the bank. I can't, the CFO cried, his voice metallic through the speaker. The wire recall is absolute. Ethan, the notice says we owe $20 million today. We don't have that in cash. All our capital is tied up in the new server farm in Jersey. If we don't pay, the collateral clause triggers. Ethan lowered the phone slowly. His face was the color of ash. The collateral? Sarah Jenkins said quietly, approaching him. Let's talk about that. Usually, a loan of this size is secured by assets, buildings, patents, intellectual property. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. But your company didn't have enough assets 18 months ago. You were already leveraged to the hilt, so you put up the only thing you had left to give. Sarah projected an image onto the courtroom screen. It was the signature page of the loan agreement. Highlighted in neon yellow was the collateral section. Collateral pledged 51% of the Class A voting shares of Sterling Digital. A collective gasp ran through the gallery. Even the court reporter stopped typing for a second. You pledged your majority stake, Sarah said. Aurora Holdings defaults. Now, it doesn't just get its money back. It absorbs your shares to cover the debt. No, Ethan whispered. He looked at Shaw. Do something. Protest. They can't just take my company. Shaw sank into his chair, defeated. They can, Ethan. You signed it. It's a secured transaction. If you can't pay the cash, the equity transfers automatically. It's ironclad. Arthur Sterling leaned into the microphone. And since you clearly don't have $20 million in your pocket, Mr. Sterling, the transfer has already been initiated. Arthur looked at his watch. In fact, 3 minutes ago, the transfer was completed. Clara Sterling is now the majority shareholder of Sterling Digital. The dismissal, the devastation was total. Ethan Sterling was not just losing a lawsuit. He was experiencing an identity death. His entire self-worth was tied to that CEO title. Without it, he was just a man in a suit he could no longer afford. But Arthur wasn't finished. He signaled to the back of the room, and since the majority shareholder is concerned about the current direction of management, the doors opened again. A short, stocky man with a briefcase walked in. It was the general counsel of Sterling Digital, Ethan's own company lawyer. But he didn't look Ethan in the eye. He walked straight to the defense table and handed a document to Clara. Clara took the document. She stood up. It was the first time she had really moved since the revelation. She smoothed her skirt and looked at Ethan. Her eyes were dry. The sadness was gone, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. "Ethan," Clara said. Her voice was quiet, but in the silent room, it rang out like a bell. Ethan looked up, with tears of rage and helplessness streaming down his face. "Clara, don't do this. I built that company. It's me. You can't separate us." "You separated us the night you chose your reputation over your wife," Clara replied. "You separated us every time you came home smelling like her perfume." She made a vague gesture toward Jessica Vance. Jessica, realizing the ship was sinking, had already physically moved her chair away from Ethan. She was frantically deleting photos from her Instagram, trying to scrub her association with the disgraced CEO in real time. Clara opened the folder the general counsel had given her. "As majority shareholder," Clara announced, "I call an emergency meeting of the board. Since I hold 51% of the vote, I don't need the others." She looked at the paper, then at him. "Motion to remove Ethan Sterling as Chief Executive Officer for cause. Specifically, gross misconduct and breach of fiduciary duty." "Clara, please," Ethan begged, standing up, his hands reaching across the aisle. "I'm sorry. I'll sign the annulment. I'll give you whatever you want. Just don't take my company." "Motion carried," Clara said, her voice unwavering. "Motion to strip Ethan Sterling of all executive privileges, corporate housing, and company transportation. Effective immediately." "Motion carried. Motion to bar Ethan Sterling from company premises pending a forensic audit of his expense accounts regarding funds used for Ms. Jessica Vance." Jessica Vance let out a small shriek of terror. "Motion carried," Clara finished. She snapped the folder shut. She looked at the judge. "Your Honor, the defense moves that the plaintiff, Sterling, no longer has standing to sue for defamation of character regarding his professional reputation, as he has been terminated for cause by his own board of directors." Judge Allister looked at Ethan. The man was broken. He was hyperventilating, tugging at his tie as if it were a noose. "Mr. Shaw," the judge said, "your client seems to be in distress. Do you wish to request a recess?" "I wish to request my withdrawal as counsel," Shaw said abruptly, standing up and gathering his briefcase. "What?" Ethan grabbed Shaw's arm. "You can't leave me. You have to fix this." Shaw brushed his arm off, looking at Ethan with undisguised contempt. "My fees are billed to Sterling Digital, Ethan. And since you are no longer the CEO and the new owner," he gave a respectful nod toward Clara, "is unlikely to authorize my invoices to defend you against her. I'm not getting paid, and I don't work for free." Shaw looked at the judge. "Mr. Sterling is indigent, Your Honor. I quit." Shaw left. Ethan was left alone. The tech king was surrounded by enemies. On one side, the wife he betrayed, now holding the keys to his kingdom. On the other, the mistress who flaunted herself, who at that moment was sending a frantic apology text to Clara's lawyer, hoping to avoid a lawsuit. And above him, the billionaire grandfather, looking down like an Old Testament god who had just flooded the earth. Arthur Sterling leaned in one last time. "You know, Ethan," the old man said, his voice conversational, which made it even more terrifying. "Clara just wanted to leave. She wanted to sign the papers, take her small savings, and disappear. She didn't want your money. She didn't want your company. She just wanted out. But you, Arthur pointed at Ethan with his cane, you had to drag her into court. You had to try to destroy her name to boost your stock price. You poked the bear in the eye, son. And now you don't just lose the girl. You lose the world. Arthur leaned back, looking satisfied. We're done here. Ethan sank into his chair, putting his head in his hands. The realization crashed over him like a tidal wave. The penthouse was company-owned. The car was a lease. The credit cards were corporate. Even the phone in his hand was an asset of Sterling Digital. He was homeless. He was broke. And he was completely alone. Clara watched him crumble. She didn't smile. There was no joy in this. Only the heavy, somber satisfaction that a balance sheet had finally been corrected. She turned to Sarah Jenkins. "Sarah," Clara whispered. "Finish it." Sarah Jenkins addressed the judge. "Your Honor, given that the plaintiff has no assets, no counsel, and no job, we move for an immediate summary judgment." We cite a ruling. The court held its breath, waiting for the gavel to fall on Ethan Sterling's life. Sentence and the walk of shame. Judge Allister took off his glasses, folding them slowly. "Mr. Sterling, in my 30 years on the bench, I have rarely seen a case that wasted the court's time with such malignant arrogance as this. You came here seeking an annulment based on fraud. The only deception found in this room, sir, is the one you practiced on yourself. You deceived yourself into believing that money buys character. You deceived yourself into believing you were untouchable." The judge picked up his gavel. "In light of the evidence presented, specifically the admission of adultery, proof of gross financial mismanagement, and the confirmed seizure of your assets by the collateral holder, this court finds your petition to be frivolous, malicious, and entirely without merit. I dismiss your lawsuit with prejudice," Judge Allister announced. "Furthermore, regarding the defendant's counterclaim for moral damages and unjustified dissolution of marital assets, I rule in favor of the defendant, Mrs. Clara Sterling de la Serna, Sterling, for the public defamation that occurred at the gala. You are ordered to pay the defendant's legal fees, totaling $121,000, as well as punitive damages of $50,000. Your Honor, please," Ethan whispered, his voice cracking into a sob. "I can't. You don't understand. They took the company. My accounts are frozen. I have nothing." "Choices," Judge Allister said. He leaned over the bench. "Then I suggest you do what millions of New Yorkers do when faced with hardship, Mr. Sterling. Go out, find a job, and work your way up. Case closed." The sound of the gavel hitting the wood was final. It was the sound of a coffin lid closing. 10 minutes later, the double doors of the court at Plaza of Justice swung open. Clara came out first. The storm had finally broken. The rain poured down, turning the streets of New York into gray rivers. But Clara didn't feel a drop. A personal security team from the Sterling family immediately raised large black umbrellas over her head. The press was waiting. A sea of cameras flashed blinding white lights, cutting through the gloom. Reporters were shouting over the thunder. "Clara, is it true you now own Sterling Digital? Mrs. Sterling, what is your first move as CEO?" Clara didn't speak to them. She didn't need to. She wore a small, triumphant smile, not of arrogance, but of relief. Arthur Sterling walked by her side, his hand gently gripping her elbow. A ghost, an elegant midnight blue Rolls-Royce Phantom, pulled up to the curb. The chauffeur, a man in an impeccable uniform, jumped out to open the door. Clara slid into the warm leather interior, safe, dry, and powerful. The car pulled away, parting the sea of reporters like a ship cutting through waves. 5 minutes passed. The reporters began to pack up, sensing the main event was over. Then Ethan came out. There was no umbrella, no guards, no Rolls Royce. He stepped out onto the granite stairs, and the wind immediately whipped his expensive suit jacket. The rain soaked him instantly, plastering his hair to his head. He looked around, bewildered. For the past 10 years, there had always been a car waiting for him. A chauffeur had always been there to protect him. He tried to use his phone. His fingers were shaking uncontrollably. He tapped the Uber app. Account suspended. Payment method denied. He stared at the screen, blinking rain out of his eyes. He tried his banking app. Access denied. Contact branch manager. He stood there, water dripping from the tip of his nose, shivering violently. A cameraman from a local news station who was packing up his gear saw him. He didn't lift his camera. He simply laughed. "Hey, it's Sterling!" the cameraman shouted. "The subway station is 2 blocks that way. Better run, pal. You're ruining the suit." Ethan looked at his charcoal Armani suit, a garment that cost $5,000. It was ruined, heavy with water, limp, pathetic. He took a step down the stairs, his Italian leather shoes slipping on the wet stone. He had to grab the railing to keep from falling. He looked up at the towering skyscrapers of New York, buildings he used to think he owned. Now they just looked like tombstones. He turned up his collar, he bowed his head, and he began to walk into the gray, freezing rain, invisible and alone, in the heart of New York. Karma dresses as a valet 6 months later. New York has a short memory. The Sterling digital scandal was news for a week. Then it was replaced by the next big thing. The company itself had recovered remarkably. Rebranded as Sterling Tech, it was now an industry leader in ethical software development. Now, Clara Sterling de la Serna was on the cover of Forbes. Ethan Sterling, however, had not recovered. The fall had been brutal and total, without a reference, without a degree. It turned out he had lied about finishing his MBA, and with a Google search result that labeled him as a toxic asset, no reputable firm would touch him. He was evicted from his penthouse 3 days after the trial. He had sold his watch collection to pay for a motel in New Jersey. When that money ran out, he moved into a studio in the Bronx without heat. Now he was standing outside the St. Regis Hotel in New York, on 5th Avenue. It was the night of the annual Sterling Charity Gala, the same event where a year before he had thrown out his wife. But Ethan was not a guest. He wore a red polyester vest that fit too tightly across his shoulders. A cheap plastic tag pinned to his chest said, "Ethan, valet parking." "Hey, rookie," shouted the valet supervisor, a 20-year-old kid named Javi. "Stop dreaming. An avalanche is coming. Only VIP, don't scratch anything or I'll deduct it from your pay." "Yes, Javi, I got it," Ethan muttered, keeping his head down. Shame burned in his stomach like acid. He used to give guys like Javi a $100 tip just for opening the door. Now he was taking orders from them. A line of luxury cars stretched down the street. Ferraris, Lamborghinis, Maybachs. The smell of exhaust mixed with the scent of expensive perfume floating from the hotel entrance. It was a torture designed specifically for him. "Next car! Move it, Blackwood!" Javi shouted. A long black limousine pulled up to the curb. It was the lead car of the night. The flags on the hood indicated it belonged to the hostess of the event. Ethan froze. He knew who was in that car. "Sterling, open the door!" Javi shouted. Ethan's legs felt like lead. He wanted to run. He wanted to hide in the alley. But he needed this job. He had to pay rent tomorrow. If he left, he'd be on the street. He forced himself to move. He walked toward the rear passenger door of the limousine. His hand, rough and cracked from the cold, gripped the polished chrome handle. He took a deep breath, swallowed his pride, and opened the door. "Good evening. Welcome to the St. Regis," Ethan recited, looking strictly at the pavement. A pair of shoes stepped out. They were gold heels with diamond-encrusted straps. Ethan couldn't help it. His eyes traveled upward. The dress was liquid gold, shimmering under the hotel's marquee lights. It flowed around her like armor. Clara stood there, more beautiful than he had ever seen her. She was no longer the shy woman in the gray cardigan. She was a queen in her prime. Beside her, a man stepped out. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He wore a modern, stylish suit. No tie. He had a kind face and warm eyes. He held Clara's hand, not gripping it for control, but holding it for connection. Clara paused. She adjusted her clutch. Then she looked at the valet holding her door. For a second, time seemed to stand still. The noise of the city, the taxis honking, the chatter of the paparazzi faded into a dull roar. Ethan stared at her, his mouth slightly open, his heart hammered against his ribs. He waited for the explosion. He waited for her to laugh at him. He waited for her to point him out to her new partner and say, "Look, that's the loser who threw me away." He waited for the rage, but there was no rage. Clara looked at Ethan Sterling. She looked at his cheap red vest. She looked at his tired face with expression lines. She looked at his name tag, and her expression didn't change. Her eyes were completely void of emotion. There was no hatred, no love, no pity, no triumph. It was the look you give a stranger on the subway. It was the look you give a piece of furniture. She looked right through him. To her, the man holding the door was not Ethan Sterling, the ex-husband who broke her heart. He was just the help. He was a non-entity. He was a ghost of a life she had already forgotten. She turned her head, breaking contact without a second thought. She looked at her partner and smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that reached her eyes. "Shall we go in?" she asked the man. "Grandpa is waiting." "After you," the man said softly. Clara passed Ethan. The train of her gold dress brushed against his cheap polyester pants. The scent of her perfume, jasmine and vanilla, filled his nose. A painful memory of what he once had. She walked down the red carpet, camera flashes exploding in a frenzy of adoration. The heavy velvet ropes opened for her. The doorman bowed. She disappeared into the warmth and light of the gala. Ethan stood on the curb, holding the handle of an empty car. "Hey, buddy, close the door," the limo driver shouted from the front window. "I gotta move. You're blocking traffic." Ethan snapped out of his trance. "Sorry," he muttered. "Sorry, sir." He slammed the door. The limousine pulled away, splashing dirty water from a puddle onto Ethan's shoes. "Sterling!" Javi shouted from the podium. "Stop standing still! There's a Mercedes coming, hurry up!" Ethan wiped a drop of rain from his cheek. He looked at the golden glow of the hotel entrance one last time. He realized then that hatred would have been better. If she hated him, it meant he still mattered. But the indifference proved he was truly, absolutely gone. He buttoned his cheap red vest, bowed his head, and shuffled toward the next car. "Yes, sir," Ethan whispered to the empty air. "Right away, sir." The rain began to fall harder, blurring him into the gray background of the city. Just another face in the crowd, parking cars for the people who mattered. The end, meaningful finale, the conclusion. Ethan Sterling learned the hardest lesson of all. When you treat people like trash, don't be surprised when they turn out to be the treasure you can no longer afford. He mistook kindness for weakness and silence for submission, never realizing that the wheel of karma is always turning. He threw his wife into the rain to save his image, only to wash away his own future in the process. It serves as a brutal reminder to all of us striving for success in the city of New York. Be careful who you step on while climbing the ladder, because you will meet them again on your way down. Interaction. Call to action. Now it's your turn, audience. What do you think? Do you think Ethan deserved his fate, or was the punishment of indifference too cruel? Would you have acted as she did if you had the power of the Sterling family behind you? Tell us in the comments below. We want to hear your opinion. If you enjoyed this story of justice served with an American touch, please hit that like button. Share this tale with a friend who needs to see that karma exists. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Thanks for reading.